The Chinese Armed Forces Disappearance Act. In recent months, several high-ranking Chinese generals have disappeared from public view, including the Minister of National Defense and the leadership of China's Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Force. These disappearances are particularly striking given the widespread perception that Chinese President Xi Jinping holds absolute control of the People's Liberation Army (PLA) and has been relentless in his anti-corruption efforts since taking power. The very fact that such incidents have not only continued but also targeted some of the most sensitive parts of the PLA underscores the limits of the power of both Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party (CCP). For decades, the CCP granted the PLA considerable autonomy to manage its own affairs. This arrangement, which allows the armed forces a high degree of independence, was intended to ensure their political loyalty to Xi and the party. However, without the checks and balances of a democratic system, it has also created an environment conducive to misconduct and a lack of accountability. While the details of the recent purges remain unclear, they fundamentally reflect Xi Jinping's profound lack of trust in some of his most senior officers. These doubts about the competence of his personnel and the equipment they manage could significantly influence Xi Jinping's views on the risks of initiating a conflict. If Xi Jinping is uncertain that the decision to use force will achieve the intended results, this could serve as a powerful deterrent to war. As long as Xi Jinping doubts the stories his own generals tell him, his distrust of his own military will likely serve as a crucial check on any military adventurism. The recent string of disappearances began in August when the commander and political commissar of the People's Liberation Army (PLA) Rocket Force were replaced by members of the Navy and Air Force. This coincides with persistent rumors of widespread corruption and the sale of military secrets at the highest levels of the military. While no official charges have been publicly announced, the chain of events continued when the head of China's military tribunal was dismissed by the National People's Congress. Then, in September, observers noted that Defense Minister Li Shangfu had been absent from public view for an extended period, validating rumors that he was also under investigation for corruption. These disappearances caught many observers by surprise. Xi Jinping is often portrayed as the most powerful leader in the Chinese military since Deng Xiaoping's chairmanship of the Central Military Commission (CMC) in the 1980s. Xi Jinping was deeply involved in military affairs long before his ascension to the CMC chairmanship in 2012. He is the son of a prominent Red Army commander and was an ally of Mao Zedong. He later served as vice chairman of the CMC under President Hu Jintao from 2010 to 2012. Since then, Xi Jinping has cemented his authority by championing the CMC Chairman Responsibility System, which gives the chairman ultimate responsibility for major military decisions. He also devoted more time than his predecessors to inspecting military units and published several military treatises that became required reading for all members of the armed forces. One of Xi Jinping's main tasks early in his tenure was to eliminate high-ranking officers who were corrupt, politically disloyal, or both. His initial anti-corruption campaign netted at least 45 high-ranking military officers between 2013 and 2016, as well as retired generals such as former CMC Vice Chairman Su Kaiho and Guo Boshang. However, anti-corruption investigations have become less common since then, fostering the narrative that Xi Jinping's initial efforts were largely successful. At the 20th Chinese Communist Party Congress last year, Xi Jinping personally selected a new group of officials for the CMC, including the now-departed Defense Minister Li Shangfu. These choices were presumably considered trustworthy, competent, and loyal, making the recent incidents all the more surprising. The specific cases are all the more alarming given the sensitive positions these officers held. The Rocket Force is responsible for China's intercontinental ballistic missiles, making it one of the most critical and secretive branches of the military. The military tribunal is part of the internal oversight apparatus, and like any justice system, its leadership must be beyond reproach to perform its duties. The Minister of Defense is one of 6 uniformed officers in the CMC and serves as China's top military diplomat, managing crucial relationships with forces such as the Russian military. It was widely assumed that candidates for these positions underwent the most rigorous selection process imaginable and were personally approved by Xi Jinping. His failure to ensure the fulfillment of these critical functions raises serious questions about Xi Jinping's broader success in managing the military. The disappearances suggest that Xi Jinping's control over the military may be less complete than previously believed. They also reflect the fundamental structure of civil-military relations in China, which helps explain how corruption and mismanagement can persist even in the most sensitive parts of the military. While Xi Jinping has established himself as the most powerful CMC chairman in decades, the PLA remains, at its core, an autonomous institution. Unlike Western militaries, there are no external checks and balances like congressional oversight, an independent judiciary, or investigative journalists. With few exceptions, Xi Jinping has also not brought in close civilian aides who knew him throughout his career. The PLA has always been a closed institution, but it achieved even higher levels of autonomy in the 1980s under Deng Xiaoping. But Deng preferred to be surrounded by civilian technocrats and ordered the military to return to their barracks. There, they were to focus strictly on military modernization with modest budgets. The implicit agreement was that the army would be free to operate as it wished, as long as it accepted the party's dominance and did not become a political threat. Deng also allowed the military to create vast commercial empires, which in the 1990s resulted in notorious cases of military purchasing agents importing and selling luxury cars. Deng's successors, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, had great difficulty in persuading the military to give up these ventures. Xi Jinping also continued to try and make the military cleaner, more efficient, and most importantly, more professional. In a landmark 2014 speech in Gutian, the site of the famous 1929 Party Congress that established the principle of the party commanding the gun, Xi Jinping preached the virtues of proper discipline among PLA officers, whom he accused of being too relaxed in their duties and too focused on personal enrichment at the expense of their professional responsibilities to fight and win wars. Along with the anti-corruption campaign, Xi Jinping reorganized the bureaucracy to promote better management, granting more authority to financial auditors and anti-corruption inspectors. However, Xi Jinping did not alter the core bargain offered to the military by Deng. Wang Qishan, who oversaw the anti-corruption purges in the civilian bureaucracy, had no authority to do the same in the military. The primary reason for this autonomy was that Xi Jinping needed to win and maintain the army's support. While determined to eradicate networks of corrupt and potentially disloyal officers, he needed the backing of key military leaders to consolidate his power and implement the most comprehensive military reform since the 1950s. This reform included a reduction of 300,000 personnel and a decrease in the influential ground forces share of the total force from over two-thirds to less than half. The bureaucratic resistance that had stymied previous Chinese leaders' military reform plans was overcome because Xi Jinping secured the support of military leaders by allowing the army to remain largely free from external oversight. As a further incentive, Xi Jinping followed traditional promotion and retirement norms, finding new positions for senior officers displaced in the reorganization and allowing them to serve out their terms with full benefits. The loose oversight of the military was accompanied by continuous increases in military budgets. From 2012 to 2022, China's official defense spending more than doubled, from $106 billion to $230 billion. Many China analysts argue the increase is even larger outside the official figures. Around 40% of this was allocated to the acquisitions budget, where it funded lavish programs like aircraft carriers, modernized fighter jets, and a large expansion of China's nuclear arsenal. Individuals like the leaders of the rocket force and other commanders responsible for oversight were all well positioned to profit from this bloating of the budget. They had the means, motive, and opportunity to enrich themselves despite Xi's rhetoric on anti-corruption and professionalization. This also helps explain why such cases of corruption have persisted a decade into his term and in such sensitive positions. The political necessity for Xi Jinping to grant the army a high degree of autonomy also explains other surprising cases of the military seemingly operating outside the bounds of civilian control. Among them are the controversial infrastructure construction plans in Bhutan's Doklam region, which provoked a diplomatic crisis with India in 2017 and seemed to catch the leadership off guard. There was also the spy balloon incident in February, which was likely the army conducting clandestine programs without civilian oversight or coordination. In some respects, the military remains an undisciplined institution, unlikely to stage a coup, but also poorly supervised. The evident loss of confidence in some of the PLA's top leaders raises new questions about how much corruption still exists in the acquisition system and what else the army may be hiding in terms of spending and operations. This, coupled with the party's focus on fixing a struggling economy, means that new issues of mismanagement within the military will likely demand more of Xi's time and attention. The lack of confidence in the military will also likely influence the Communist Party's considerations about initiating a war in the coming years. Given his track record, Xi Jinping is probably aware that the military is an institution prone to scandal and difficult to control, despite propaganda efforts and periodic anti-corruption campaigns. Recent cases only deepen the suspicion that the military may be hiding other deficiencies, including in critical equipment acquired over the past decade. This could affect military readiness, or at least the perceptions among the civilian elite about how capable and trustworthy these forces might be in a military conflict. They would have to ask themselves what could go wrong if the army were called upon to go beyond symbolic displays of power and enter a real conflict against a capable adversary. We don't need to look far to understand the consequences of such a miscalculation. The Chinese's major ally, Russia, fell into just such a trap when it made the fateful decision to invade Ukraine. Thus, such concerns should weigh heavily on the decisions that Xi Jinping and the Politburo Standing Committee make about entering a conflict with the United States and Taiwan. In summary, Xi Jinping can take credit for building a powerful peacetime military that presents undeniable challenges for Taiwan and other regional rivals. But precisely because he needed the institutional support of the army, he hesitated to disturb the bureaucratic status quo. Xi's knowledge of the secrecy and mismanagement within his own military could lead him to doubt its operational competence in a crisis or a conflict. Therefore, while the United States worries about how to militarily deter Chinese aggression, the biggest obstacle to China initiating a conflict may be found much closer to home.